Hi, welcome back to our study in Genesis. We are closing in on the very end of the book, and in chapters 48 and 49, we see Jacob on his deathbed now, 147 years old, giving his final blessings to his sons. So I just want to look at chapter 48 right now in how Jacob deals with his son Joseph. Of course, Joseph is the one whom God has used mostly in this narrative since all the way back to chapter 37. He's the one that God has used to position in Egypt to save Jacob and his whole family from the famine, to bring them down. And now we're seeing the conclusion here as we draw to the end of the book. And we have this scene where Jacob calls for Joseph and for Joseph to bring his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to come to him literally on his deathbed so that he can provide for them a blessing. And we see that from the text, it tells us that Jacob's eyesight is diminished. He can hardly see at all. So he has to work with that hindrance. So Joseph brings the sons to Jacob. Jacob begins to recount God's faithfulness to him and how God had appeared to him, the promises that were made. We see those reiterated again, and you've seen it all through Genesis, the promises of God first made to Abraham and then reiterated to Isaac and then to Jacob. And Jacob here at the end of his life is telling them to Joseph again about this promised land, this inheritance to become a great people. And you got to remember, all of this time now, 3 generations, it hasn't happened. God has promised it, but they have just been pilgrims. They have been squatters, essentially, in the land of Canaan. Now they're in Egypt. So for 3 generations, they know that promises that God has made is true, but yet they have not yet been fulfilled. So don't miss that. And it's still going to take some time before that happens. But in this chapter, we see this interesting account of Jacob blessing the sons of Joseph. So Joseph brings Manasseh, he brings Ephraim to them. He puts both of those young men before Jacob. And Joseph expects that he will bless them accordingly, the way he should, which of course is a larger, a greater percentage of the blessing, you might say, on the firstborn, the older, but also blessing the secondborn, but maybe not to the extent. That was what should be expected in the culture. That's what would be normal. But in the book of Genesis, we've also realized that rarely happens. We keep seeing this reversal of the younger ascending over the older. And here at the very end, we see the same thing happen again. When the boys come, the young men, I should say, come to Jacob for the blessing, of course, it's signified by the right hand and the left hand. There's a lot in there about that it would have been expected that Jacob putting his right hand on the one who was the older, who would receive the greater blessing, the left on the younger, who would receive the lesser blessing. And what Jacob does is at the last moment, he crosses his arms in a final act of trickery by Jacob, and he reverses the blessing. Of course, Joseph reacts strongly to it because he believes it's inappropriate. But Jacob seems very sure of himself, even from the Lord, that this is the right thing to do. And he says Manasseh will as well, even as the older, receive a considerable inheritance and blessing as well, but not to the degree that Ephraim would get it. And it's interesting that Jacob just adopts Joseph's first 2 born. Now he says the rest of your sons will not be, but those first 2, Manasseh and Ephraim, will be just like my own sons, just like Reuben and Simeon. They will be just like my own sons. And what this is about is that they are going to be included in the promise, included in the inheritance of the land in the future as the people of Israel, as the people of Jacob. And we certainly will see that play out as the Old Testament continues to march forward in its story and we continue to encounter them. One of the interesting things about this chapter is it helps us, and sometimes the Bible just does this. There may not be a tremendous amount of lesson per se in it, but there's a tremendous amount of understanding that's in it. And this chapter is kind of one of those chapters, because in it, if we did not understand this event, if we did not understand the significance of it, when we ran into the name Ephraim later in the Old Testament, we might be left scratching our heads a little bit going, what is this Ephraim? Who is this? What is this about? Because as we move through the Old Testament, we see that Ephraim comes to have a significant place among the story of Israel. Ephraim, as a tribe, would be given land that would occupy a significant place kind of northwest of the Dead Sea once the land is moved into and conquered, as it's all recorded there in the book of Joshua. They would become the leading tribe in the northern part of the kingdom, so to speak. Other people would come from this tribe, significant people like Joshua and Samuel. They would both be Ephraimites. As we move through the prophets, even in the Old Testament, we see that prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea, they mention Ephraim, and Ephraim is essentially synonymous. It's a indication, it's a designation for Israel as a nation. So when you're reading through the Old Testament and you run into places where it talks about Ephraim, whether it's about God's love for Ephraim or God's judgment upon Ephraim or whatever it may be, that's synonymous with Israel itself in that northern part of the kingdom. So this is a fascinating story of how Jacob, at the very end, he's recounting his sad life. He is even mentioning Rachel once again. He shows a final act of favoritism upon Joseph, because he says, not only are these boys going to be blessed, they're going to inherit the land as well. I've actually marked off a really nice portion of land that I once took, he said, from the Amorites. Now, we're not sure exactly where this was or when it happened. It doesn't appear to be an account that was recorded in Genesis. But he even shows that last act of favoritism. And I suppose what all of this reminds me of is when we look at someone like Jacob from beginning to end through his whole story, it's so flawed. It is so messed up in so many ways. But yet we see God continuing to use it all along the way, even to the very last end where he is still showing this favoritism. He still has all of this sadness in his life. We see how God continues to take even such flawed circumstances and flawed people and continue to use them for his purposes. If we've learned anything in Genesis, we've learned that it is the story about God. There's a lot of fascinating stories about people and characters, and we learn a lot of good things and bad things from those examples. But never forget, as we study the Bible, it's God's story. It's about what he has done and what he is doing, ultimately always leading us to Christ, ultimately leading to how he will always bring everything back to creation and to all that is good. But pay attention to the details, because it'll make you a better studier of the Bible as you move through it. Understanding the history, even just the little details of a story like this, helps you connect those dots and understand God's plan even better as you read along through the Bible. I'm so glad that you're reading Genesis. Continue to read just a couple more chapters 49, 50, and then we'll conclude that. And then we're going to be getting started back in person in our midweek Bible study on June the 3rd. And on June the 3rd, we're going to begin moving through the book of Exodus, the part of the story that comes next. So I hope you'll continue to finish up Genesis, finish strong, and then even join us in person June the 3rd as we begin the book of Exodus.